Nothing reveals what people truly value faster than a funeral. I wish that statement were not true, but the week my father died proved it in ways I never could have imagined. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 days after we buried my father, I watched my brothers turn against each other over a piece of land that had been in our family for generations. Looking back now, I think the fight started long before the funeral. The funeral simply gave it a place to surface. My father, Robert Carter, had spent nearly 60 years working the family farm outside Mason Ridge, Kentucky. The property stretched across nearly 80 acres of rolling fields, old oak trees, and pasture land bordered by a narrow creek. To outsiders, it was just another piece of rural property. To my father, it was home. Every fence post, every weathered barn board, every acre carried a memory. He knew the land the way some people know their closest friends. Even after age slowed him down, he would walk the property every morning before sunrise, coffee in hand, checking fences and watching the mist rise over the fields. For most of my life, I believed all 3 of his children understood what the farm meant to him. Apparently, I was wrong. The funeral itself was beautiful. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and church members filled every seat. People shared stories about my father's kindness, his work ethic, and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. My mother, Helen, sat quietly in the front row holding a tissue. She looked smaller somehow. Losing a spouse after 42 years can do that to a person. My oldest brother, Michael, stood beside her greeting visitors. My middle brother, Daniel, handled most of the arrangements. For a few hours, it felt like grief had brought us together. We laughed through tears. We shared memories. We hugged relatives we had not seen in years. It felt like a family should feel during a difficult time. Then the funeral ended. The next morning, I drove out to the farm to help my mother sort through paperwork and household tasks. Michael arrived shortly after I did. Daniel showed up about 20 minutes later. At first, everything seemed normal. We sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee while discussing practical matters. Insurance paperwork, utility bills, maintenance on the property, the kinds of conversations families have after a loss. Then Michael mentioned something that changed the atmosphere immediately. He had recently spoken with a real estate developer interested in purchasing farmland near Mason Ridge. According to him, the offer would be substantial. Daniel set down his coffee cup so hard that liquid splashed onto the table. "You already talked to a developer?" he asked. Michael shrugged. "I was gathering information." 3 days after Dad's funeral, the tension in the room became immediate and unmistakable. My mother looked uncomfortable. I exchanged a glance with her, hoping someone would change the subject. Nobody did. Michael leaned back in his chair. "The farm is worth a fortune now. We need to be realistic." Daniel shook his head. "That land is not for sale." Michael laughed without humor. "You do not get to decide that by yourself." What began as a disagreement quickly became something deeper. Years of old frustrations started slipping into the conversation. Complaints from childhood, arguments about responsibility, accusations about who spent more time helping our parents. The land became less important than the emotions attached to it. I sat there listening, stunned by how quickly grief had transformed into conflict. Then something happened that made me realize this situation was only beginning. My mother quietly stood up and left the room. A few minutes later, I found her sitting alone on the back porch staring toward the fields. She did not seem angry. She seemed tired. "Dad never wanted this," I said softly. She nodded. Then she looked out toward the far edge of the property where the old barn stood against the horizon. "There is something your father wanted all of you to find," she said. But I do not think any of us understood what he meant. At the time, I had no idea those words would lead me toward a secret hidden for years. A secret buried somewhere on the very land my brothers were already preparing to fight over. For the next several days, the atmosphere at the farm felt nothing like the place where I had grown up. As children, Michael, Daniel, and I had spent summers running through those fields, climbing fences we were not supposed to climb, and helping our father with chores we often complained about. Back then, the farm had been the center of our world. Now it felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot to be fired. The strange part was that the land itself had not changed. The same hills rolled across the horizon. The same creek wound through the property. The same weathered barn stood near the northern pasture. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The people were what had changed. Every morning, I helped my mother sort through paperwork while my brothers continued their arguments. Sometimes the disagreements happened in person. Other times they happened through phone calls and messages that left everyone frustrated. Michael insisted the land represented financial security. He argued that selling it would solve problems for all of us. Daniel believed selling it would destroy everything our father had spent his life protecting. Neither man seemed willing to consider the other's perspective. One afternoon, while organizing old filing cabinets in my father's study, I found myself distracted by memories. The room smelled faintly of wood, leather, and old paper. My father had spent countless evenings there balancing farm accounts or reading history books. Sitting at his desk felt almost like sitting beside him again. As I sorted documents, I remembered something he used to say whenever people asked why he never sold the property. Some things are worth more than money. At the time, I assumed he was speaking emotionally. Now I was not so sure. Later that evening, I joined my mother on the back porch. The sun was setting behind the fields, casting long shadows across the grass. For several minutes, we sat quietly watching the familiar landscape. Finally, I asked about the comment she had made after the funeral. The one about our father wanting us to find something. She looked toward the old barn before answering. About a year ago, your father started talking about a project he never finished. What kind of project? I asked. She shook her head slowly. He never explained it clearly. He just kept saying that one day all of you would understand why the land mattered. I frowned. Did he leave any notes? If he did, I have not found them. Her answer only deepened the mystery. That night, I could not stop thinking about it. The next morning, I decided to walk the property alone. I followed the same paths my father had walked for decades. The air smelled of fresh grass and damp earth. Birds moved through the trees along the creek. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of him. The fence he repaired every spring. The tractor he refused to replace even when newer models became available. The oak tree where he taught us how to fish when we were children. As I approached the old barn, I noticed something unusual. Near the entrance sat a wooden toolbox I did not recognize. It looked old but well-maintained. Curious, I opened it. Inside were measuring tapes, notebooks, pencils, and several folded maps of the property. My pulse quickened. The maps appeared recently used. Certain sections of the farm had been marked with circles and handwritten notes. Most of the writing made little sense to me, but one phrase appeared repeatedly. North Ridge Marker. I stared at those words for several seconds. The North Ridge sat nearly half a mile beyond the barn near the edge of the property. I had not visited that area in years. Before I could study the maps further, I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel had arrived. When he saw the maps spread across the workbench, his expression changed immediately. "Where did you find those?" he asked. I explained about the toolbox. He stepped closer and examined the markings. Then he said something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Dad showed me one of these maps about 6 months ago," he said quietly. "He told me there was something important hidden on this land. Something he wanted us to discover after he was gone." Suddenly, my mother's strange comment no longer sounded like grief talking. It sounded like a clue. And for the first time since the funeral, I began to suspect that my father's greatest inheritance might not be written in any will at all. Daniel's words stayed with me for the rest of the day. My father had shown him one of the maps. That meant whatever secret existed was not something he imagined near the end of his life. It was real. More importantly, it was intentional. My father wanted us to find it. The question was why. Daniel and I carried the maps back to the house and spread them across the dining room table. Several sections of the property had been marked with circles, arrows, and handwritten notes. Most of the markings appeared to reference landmarks that only someone familiar with the farm would recognize. The old well, the southern fence line, the creek crossing. The largest concentration of notes pointed toward the North Ridge. As we studied the maps, Michael walked into the room. The moment he saw the documents, his expression became suspicious. "What is all this?" he asked. Daniel explained what we had found in the barn. Michael listened quietly until the mention of something hidden on the property. Then he folded his arms. "So now we are hunting for treasure?" The sarcasm in his voice immediately irritated Daniel. Nobody said anything about treasure. Michael shrugged. "Because that is exactly what this sounds like." I quickly stepped between the conversation before it turned into another argument. "Dad left clues for a reason. We should at least try to understand them." Michael shook his head but eventually pulled out a chair and joined us. For the next hour, All three of us examined the maps together. It was the first time since the funeral that we had worked on anything as a team. Even then, the cooperation felt fragile. Every disagreement threatened to become another fight. By late afternoon, we identified something unusual. One of the maps contained a small handwritten note in my father's familiar script. Most of the words had faded with time, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. Follow where memory began. We stared at the phrase in silence. Michael looked confused. Daniel looked thoughtful. I felt something else entirely. Recognition. The words reminded me of stories my father used to tell when we were children. Stories about our great-grandfather purchasing the original acreage nearly a century earlier. Stories about the first cabin built on the property before the farmhouse existed. Stories about how our family started with almost nothing except determination and hope. I think I know what he meant, I said quietly. The next morning, we drove out to the North Ridge together. The area sat near the edge of the property where the land sloped gently toward a wooded section rarely visited anymore. As children, we sometimes played there during summer afternoons. Over time, nature reclaimed much of the area. Tall grass covered old pathways. Trees shaded sections that had once been open fields. Following the map, we eventually reached a clearing. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable. Then Daniel pointed toward a cluster of stones partially hidden beneath weeds. We walked closer. The stones formed a rough outline of a small rectangular foundation. Suddenly I understood. The first cabin, I whispered. According to family stories, our great-grandfather built a simple wooden cabin there when he first purchased the land. The structure disappeared decades ago, but the foundation remained. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The place felt strangely important despite its simplicity. Then Michael noticed something else. One of the stones near the center appeared recently moved. Kneeling down, he brushed away dirt and revealed a small metal marker embedded beneath it. My pulse quickened. We carefully cleared more soil until a symbol became visible. It matched a symbol drawn repeatedly throughout my father's maps. The same symbol appeared beside the words North Ridge marker. Excitement replaced tension. For the first time, all three of us focused on the mystery instead of our disagreements. Whatever my father wanted us to find, we were getting closer. But before we could continue searching, another discovery changed everything. Tucked beneath one of the maps, I found an envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. Across the front, he had written 5 words that instantly sent a chill through me. Open only when together. The envelope sat in the center of the kitchen table as though it carried the weight of the entire farm. None of us spoke for several seconds. My father had written thousands of notes during his lifetime. Grocery lists, maintenance reminders, instructions for planting seasons. But this felt different. The handwriting across the front was steady and deliberate. Open only when together. Not one child. Not 2. All 3. Somehow, even after his death, my father was still finding ways to bring us into the same room. My mother joined us as we carefully examined the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the seal remained intact. I have never seen this before, she said quietly. Michael leaned forward. Then open it. For once, nobody argued. I slid my finger beneath the flap and carefully unfolded the letter inside. Several pages rested within. The first line immediately caught my attention. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and hopefully the 3 of you are sitting together. I glanced around the table. For the first time since the funeral, we were exactly where he wanted us to be. The letter continued in the familiar voice I had known my entire life. My father wrote about the farm. He wrote about family history. He wrote about mistakes he had made and lessons he hoped we would learn. Then he addressed the conflict he clearly anticipated. He knew the land would become a source of disagreement. He knew each of us would see it differently. What surprised me was how accurately he understood my brothers. Michael saw opportunity. Daniel saw responsibility. Neither viewpoint was entirely wrong. The letter did not take sides. Instead, it pointed us toward another clue. Near the end of the second page, my father referenced a metal box hidden somewhere on the property. According to him, the box contained the final piece of the story. He also included a simple instruction. Follow the markers. The answer is where our future meets our past. Michael immediately stood up. So there really is something hidden. Daniel rolled his eyes. You are still thinking about value. What if it has value? Michael replied. What if that is exactly why Dad left it? The argument threatened to return. I could see it happening. The familiar tension. The defensive tone, the assumptions. Then my mother spoke. Maybe the problem is that both of you keep deciding what your father meant before you know the whole story. Silence followed. Neither brother had an answer for that. The next morning, we returned to the North Ridge carrying the maps and letter. Following the markings became easier now that we understood what we were looking for. The symbol we discovered near the old cabin foundation appeared repeatedly across the property. One marker led us to an oak tree overlooking the creek. Another pointed toward an abandoned fence line no longer in use. At each location, we found small metal markers partially hidden beneath soil or vegetation. It felt less like a treasure hunt and more like following a trail of memories my father intentionally created. Hours passed as we moved from one location to the next. Surprisingly, the journey began changing the atmosphere between us. At every stop, one of us remembered a story connected to that place. Michael recalled helping Dad repair fences during a summer storm. Daniel remembered learning to drive a tractor near the southern pasture. I remembered family picnics beside the creek. Little by little, the farm stopped being an asset and became a collection of shared experiences again. Late that afternoon, the final marker led us to the oldest section of the property near a large maple tree overlooking the valley. A weathered wooden bench sat beneath its branches. My father often came there at sunset. As children, we rarely understood why. Now I suspected he simply loved the view. Beneath the bench, Daniel discovered another clue. A narrow metal plate had been attached to one of the support beams. Etched into its surface were a set of coordinates and a short sentence. The coordinates pointed toward a location near the old barn. The sentence was even more intriguing. What you seek was buried where new beginnings were born. We stared at the inscription as the evening sun dipped toward the horizon. Somewhere on this farm, a metal box waited. Somewhere inside that box rested the final message my father wanted us to hear. And for the first time since his funeral, all three of us wanted to find it for exactly the same reason. The coordinates etched into the metal plate led us back toward the oldest section of the farm near the barn. By the time we arrived, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. We stood quietly for a moment looking at the weathered structure. The barn had been part of the property longer than any of us had been alive. My father often called it the heart of the farm. Growing up, I never understood why. It was simply where equipment was stored and repairs were made. Now I wondered if it had always meant something more to him. The next morning, we returned with the coordinates, measuring tape, and copies of the maps. Following my father's clues required patience. The coordinates pointed us to a spot several yards behind the barn near a section of ground that appeared completely ordinary. There were no markers, no signs, just grass and soil. Michael looked frustrated. What if we are wasting our time? Daniel shook his head. Dad did not spend years setting this up for nothing. I agreed. Everything about the clues felt deliberate. My father was not a man who acted without purpose. If he wanted us here, there was a reason. We measured the distance indicated by the coordinates and eventually identified a small area near an old apple tree. The tree itself was significant. According to family stories, it was planted by our grandfather shortly after he returned from military service. Suddenly, the phrase from the metal plate made sense. What you seek was buried where new beginnings were born. New beginnings. The apple tree represented one. The farm itself represented another. We began searching carefully around the base of the tree. For nearly an hour, we found nothing. Then Daniel's shovel struck something solid beneath the soil. The sound instantly silenced all three of us. We exchanged glances before continuing more carefully. A few minutes later, the corner of a small metal container emerged from the dirt. My heart raced. After all the clues, all the arguments, and all the uncertainty, we had finally found it. The box was not large, roughly the size of a briefcase. Its surface showed signs of age, but it remained sealed and remarkably well preserved. For a moment, nobody moved. It felt strange, almost sacred, as though opening it would somehow bring us face to face with our father again. Finally, Michael knelt beside the box. Well, he said quietly, we came this far. Together, we lifted it from the ground and carried it back to the farmhouse. My mother was waiting when we arrived. The moment she saw the container resting on the kitchen table, tears appeared in her eyes. He really did leave something, she whispered. We gathered around the table just as we had when reading the letter. The atmosphere felt entirely different now. The tension that had dominated the previous week seemed distant. Curiosity had replaced conflict. Carefully, Daniel released the latches. The lid opened with a soft metallic sound. Inside were several items wrapped in cloth and protected from moisture. At the very top sat another envelope addressed to all three of us. Beneath it rested old photographs, journals, and what appeared to be legal documents. But it was the envelope that captured our attention. I opened it slowly. Inside was another handwritten letter from our father. The first lines immediately brought tears to my eyes. If you found this together, then you have already succeeded in the most important test. Nobody spoke. The room was completely silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. As I continued reading, it became clear that the box contained far more than family keepsakes. My father had spent years preparing this message. Every clue, every map, every marker, everything had been leading to this moment. What he wrote next would completely change the way we understood the farm, our family history, and the reason he never divided the land before his death. And as I turned the page to continue reading, I realized that the true inheritance had never been hidden inside the box. The box was only the key. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading the letter. Across the table, Michael, Daniel, and my mother sat in complete silence. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, as though the walls themselves were leaning closer to hear what my father wanted to say. Every word carried the weight of years. My father began by telling a story none of us had ever heard in full. Long before any of us were born, our great-grandfather nearly lost the farm. A series of bad harvests, economic hardship, and personal setbacks pushed the family to the edge of losing everything. According to the letter, several offers were made to purchase the property. The money would have solved immediate problems. It would have been the easy choice. Yet our great-grandfather refused every offer. Not because the land was especially valuable at the time, but because he believed future generations deserved the chance to decide their own future instead of inheriting someone else's convenience. As I read those words aloud, I noticed Daniel nodding slowly. Michael remained quiet. The letter continued. Over the decades, every generation faced moments when selling would have been easier. My grandfather faced those choices. My father faced them too. In each case, they chose to preserve the farm. Not because they expected us to become farmers forever. Not because they opposed change. They preserved it because the property represented something larger than acreage. It represented continuity, responsibility, family. Then I reached the section that explained why the clues existed. My father admitted he intentionally left the future of the farm unresolved in his will. At first, that statement shocked me. The confusion and arguments of the past week had not happened by accident. He knew disagreement would come. Yet as I continued reading, his reasoning became clear. He believed that if ownership was simply assigned through paperwork, we would focus only on percentages and financial value. He wanted us to rediscover the history before making any decisions. He wanted us to remember why the farm existed in the first place. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Michael stared at the table. The room remained silent except for my voice. Then came the most surprising revelation. Inside the metal box rested a collection of journals spanning nearly 70 years. My father had spent decades documenting family history, major decisions, and personal reflections. He wanted us to read them. According to the letter, the journals contained lessons learned by multiple generations. But there was something else. Tucked beneath the journals lay several legal documents. Daniel carefully removed them from the box. After examining the first few pages, his eyes widened. "Emily," he said quietly, "you need to see this." The documents revealed something none of us expected. Nearly 10 years earlier, my father had established a family trust connected to the property. The trust included specific conditions regarding the future of the farm. Most importantly, the land could not be sold unless all three children unanimously agreed after completing a review process outlined in the trust. Michael leaned forward immediately. "A review process?" Daniel nodded. We continued reading. The process required us to study the journals, review family history, and spend time on the property before making any final decision. My father had essentially created a safeguard against impulsive choices. At first glance, it seemed complicated. Then I realized what he had actually done. He had designed a system that forced us to understand the inheritance before deciding its fate. The more we read, the more impressed I became. This was not about controlling us from beyond the grave. It was about slowing us down long enough to think clearly. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Michael surprised all of us. He looked toward the box and quietly said, "I never knew any of this." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no frustration, just honesty. In that moment, I realized the conflict between my brothers had never really been about greed versus loyalty. It was about perspective. Each had been looking at the same land through a different lens. My father understood that better than anyone. The journals remained stacked on the table waiting to be opened. Somewhere within those pages rested the final pieces of the story. And as we prepared to begin reading, I had the distinct feeling that our father was not finished teaching us yet. Over the following week, the journals became the center of our lives. Every morning, we gathered around the same kitchen table where so many arguments had taken place only days earlier. The difference now was that nobody arrived prepared to defend a position. We arrived prepared to listen. The journals were organized by decade, beginning with entries written by our grandfather and continuing through most of my father's adult life. Together, they told a story far larger than any of us expected. We learned about years of drought that nearly destroyed the farm. We learned about loans that were quietly repaid through sacrifices nobody in our generation ever witnessed. We learned about relatives who worked multiple jobs to keep the property in the family during difficult economic times. The more we read, the more the farm stopped feeling like real estate and started feeling like a living history book. One afternoon, I found an entry written shortly after I was born. My father described holding me for the first time on the back porch overlooking the fields. A few pages later, he wrote about teaching Michael how to repair a broken gate and teaching Daniel how to drive a tractor. Every milestone of our lives seemed preserved in those pages. Reading them felt like discovering parts of our father we never fully knew. The most surprising changes happened within my brothers. Michael became quieter with each passing day. Sometimes I caught him reading entries long after everyone else had gone to bed. Daniel also softened. The anger that had fueled so many arguments began fading as the larger picture emerged. Neither man admitted it directly, but I could see it happening. They were beginning to understand what our father wanted us to see. Then we reached the final journal. Unlike the others, this one focused less on farm operations and more on personal reflections. My father wrote openly about aging, family, and legacy. He described watching his children build their own lives. He wrote about mistakes he regretted and lessons he hoped we would carry forward. Near the end of the journal, we discovered an entry dated less than 6 months before his death. The words immediately captured our attention. If my children are reading this together, then perhaps they finally understand what I spent years trying to teach them. The room became silent. My father went on to explain that he never expected us to remain identical in our views or priorities. Differences were natural. Disagreements were inevitable. The danger came when those disagreements became more important than the relationships themselves. Then came the passage that changed everything. According to the journal, my father had already considered selling the farm years earlier. A developer offered enough money to make retirement extremely comfortable. For a brief period, he seriously considered accepting. What changed his mind was not the land itself. It was a conversation with my grandfather shortly before his passing. My grandfather told him something simple. Land can be replaced. Family cannot. Those 5 words seemed to echo through the room. My father wrote that he spent years thinking about them. Eventually, he realized the greatest value of the property was not what it could be sold for. The greatest value was what it brought people together to remember. The final pages contained one last request. He asked us to invite extended family, close friends, and neighbors to the farm the following weekend. He wanted portions of the journals shared publicly. He wanted the story preserved. Most importantly, he wanted future generations to understand why the property mattered. Michael looked up from the journal. He planned all of this. Daniel nodded slowly. Even the conflict. My mother smiled through tears. Not the conflict. The solution. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Michael did something none of us expected. He looked directly at Daniel and quietly apologized for some of the things he had said during the past few weeks. Daniel apologized too. The exchange was brief, but genuine. Years of tension did not disappear instantly, but something important shifted. We were finally standing on the same side. The family gathering was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Relatives from multiple states planned to attend. Neighbors who had known our father for decades promised to come. As the day approached, I sensed that another important moment was waiting for us. We had uncovered the history. We had found the message. Now it was time to share the truth my father spent years protecting. And once that truth was spoken aloud, nothing about the future of the farm would ever be the same. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early autumn. By noon, vehicles lined both sides of the long gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse. Relatives traveled from neighboring counties and nearby states. Old family friends arrived carrying casseroles, desserts, and stories. Former farmhands, church members, and neighbors who had known my father for decades gathered beneath a large tent we had set up near the barn. Looking around, I realized how many lives my father had touched over the years. The farm felt alive in a way it had not since before his illness. Children played near the creek. Adults shared memories beneath the shade of old trees. For the first time since the funeral, the property felt less like a source of conflict and more like the center of a community. As the afternoon progressed, my brothers and I stood together near the barn preparing to share portions of the journals. A week earlier, such a scene would have seemed impossible. Yet here we were, united by the very thing that had nearly divided us. My mother sat in the front row beside several longtime family friends. The journals rested on a table nearby. One by one, we read selected passages aloud. Some entries made people laugh. Others brought tears. Stories of difficult harvests, family celebrations, and acts of quiet generosity painted a picture of a life many people thought they already knew. Then Michael stood and read the passage containing my grandfather's words. Land can be replaced. Family cannot. The effect was immediate. Silence settled across the gathering. The simplicity of the message seemed to reach everyone at once. When he finished reading, Michael paused longer than expected. Then he looked directly at the crowd. "A few weeks ago," he said, "I forgot that lesson." The honesty in his voice surprised many people. It surprised me too. He spoke openly about his desire to sell the property. He admitted that he focused on financial value without fully considering what the farm represented. No excuses, no defensiveness, just truth. When he sat down, Daniel stood. He admitted something as well. In his determination to protect the farm, he had become so focused on preserving the land that he stopped listening to the people around him. He cared deeply about our father's legacy, but his frustration had created distance instead of understanding. Watching my brothers speak openly felt like witnessing a bridge being rebuilt in real time. Then my mother approached the microphone. The crowd immediately grew quiet. She held one of the journals in her hands and smiled gently. "Robert spent years worrying about what would happen after he was gone," she said. "Not because of the farm, because of the family." Her voice trembled slightly. "The farm was never the inheritance. You are." Many people wiped away tears. I felt my own eyes sting. Then came the moment none of us expected. Among the legal documents in the metal box, we had discovered one final instruction that we intentionally saved until the gathering. My father requested that a portion of the property surrounding the original cabin site be permanently preserved as a family heritage area. Not for commercial development, not for profit, as a place where future generations could learn the history of those who came before them. He also encouraged us to create an annual family gathering there, a tradition dedicated to storytelling, remembrance, and connection. The reaction was overwhelming. Relatives immediately began sharing ideas. Older family members volunteered photographs and records. Younger relatives expressed excitement about preserving the history. What started as a legal instruction quickly transformed into a shared mission. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, people gathered near the original cabin foundation. Standing there, surrounded by generations of family and friends, I realized something remarkable. The conflict that once threatened to tear us apart had exposed a deeper truth. We were not arguing about land. We were struggling to understand what our father was trying to leave behind. And now that understanding was finally beginning to take shape. Yet one final decision still remained. The future ownership of the farm had not officially been determined. According to the trust, that responsibility still belonged to the three of us. Before the weekend ended, we would have to choose. And whatever decision we made would define not only the future of the property, but the legacy of everything we had learned together. The morning after the gathering felt different from every morning that had come before it. For the first time since my father's funeral, the farm was quiet in a peaceful way rather than an uncertain one. The tents had been removed. Most of the relatives had returned home. The gravel driveway was empty again. Only our family remained. The three of us met at the kitchen table shortly after breakfast. The same table that had witnessed arguments, discoveries, and difficult conversations now held the final documents from the trust. Outside the window, sunlight stretched across the fields. The land looked exactly the same as it had weeks earlier. Yet everything about it felt different. We had spent days searching for clues hidden across the property. We had uncovered journals, letters, and family history. We had listened to stories from people who knew our father throughout his life. Most importantly, we had been forced to see the farm through each other's eyes. Now there was only one question left to answer. What came next? Michael broke the silence first. He looked out the window for a moment before speaking. I do not want to sell it. The words hung in the air. A month earlier, nobody would have believed he would say them. He smiled slightly. At least not anymore. Daniel laughed softly and shook his head. Dad would probably be enjoying this. We all knew he was right. Michael leaned forward. The farm should stay in the family, but it should also serve a purpose. For the next hour, we discussed possibilities. Some ideas were practical. Others were ambitious. Eventually, a vision began taking shape. We agreed to preserve the majority of the property under the family trust exactly as our father intended. The heritage area surrounding the original cabin foundation would become a permanent place for future generations to learn the family's history. The journals would be professionally preserved and copied so that every branch of the family could access them. We also decided to establish an educational scholarship in our father's name, funded by a portion of the trust's investment income. The scholarship would support local students pursuing agriculture, environmental science, history, or community service. The more we discussed the plan, the more it felt right. It honored the past while creating opportunities for the future. Most importantly, it transformed the farm from an object of disagreement into a shared responsibility. When the paperwork was finally signed, nobody celebrated. Instead, we sat quietly for a moment. There was a sense of relief. Not because we had reached a legal agreement, because we had found our way back to each other. Later that afternoon, I walked alone to the original cabin foundation on the North Ridge, the same place where this journey truly began. The wind moved gently through the trees. The valley stretched before me in shades of green and gold. For several minutes, I stood there thinking about my father. I thought about the clues he left behind, the maps, the markers, the letters, the journals. Every step of the process had been intentional. He understood something that none of us understood at the time. Sometimes people have to take a journey together before they are ready to hear the truth. Standing there, I realized that the metal box had never contained the inheritance. The inheritance was the journey itself, the conversations, the memories, the understanding, the restoration of relationships that were beginning to fracture. My father could have divided the property through a simple legal document. Instead, he chose a harder path because he cared more about preserving his family than preserving his land. As the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon, I heard footsteps behind me. Michael and Daniel had followed me up the hill. Neither said anything at first. They simply stood beside me looking across the property. Eventually, Michael smiled. You know, he said, Dad really did get the last word. We laughed. It felt good, honest, familiar. For the first time in years, we sounded like siblings instead of opponents. Together we watched the sunlight settle across the fields our family had cared for across generations. The land remained exactly where it had always been, but the people standing on it had changed. We arrived after a funeral expecting to divide an inheritance. Instead, we discovered something far more valuable. We discovered that the greatest legacy a parent can leave behind is not measured in acres, money, or property. It is measured in the people who choose to stay connected long after everything else is gone. And standing there beside my brothers, I finally understood what my father had wanted us to find all along.